Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us here today. I want to offer a few brief remarks in terms of the purpose of this meeting. We've got a wonderful panel here and some extraordinary representatives, both heads of state, members of civil society, people who have been working on these issues for a very long time. The focus today is on civil society because it's my strong belief that the strength and success of all countries and all regions depends in part on protecting and supporting civil society. I want to thank Deputy Secretary General Eliasson. I want to thank my good friend, President Elbegdorj of Mongolia, representing the community of democracies. I want to thank Alejandro Gonzalez Arreola of Mexico, representing civil society members of the Open Government Partnership. And I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. Now, human progress has always been propelled at some level by what happens in civil society. Citizens coming together to insist that a better life is possible, pushing their leaders to protect their rights and the dignities of all people. And that's why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. This is not a Western value, this is a universal right. And civil society led the fight to end apartheid in South Africa. It led the fight to bring freedom to Eastern Europe. It helped to heal places divided by conflict, whether in Cambodia or Colombia. Here in the United States, civil society has been the catalyst of virtually every major advance that we've made, from the abolition of slavery to women's rights, civil rights, the protections of workers, and the protections of the environment. And yet, still today in every region, we see that the fight goes on. Yet we have citizens who are leading the charge to expand opportunity, to correct injustices, to shape their country's futures. And it's my belief that strong nations recognize the values of active citizens. They support and empower their citizens rather than stand in their way, even when it's inconvenient, or perhaps especially when it's inconvenient for government leaders. Strong civil societies help uphold human rights. They promote good governance by making governments more effective and holding leaders like me to account. And they're critical to economic development because in our global economy, trade and investment flows to countries that give citizens the freedom to create and develop new ideas and that are protected by rule of law. So many countries, including those in this room, are working in partnership with civil societies, from Mongolia to Mexico, Tunisia, Tanzania. Governments and citizens are working together to improve the rule of law, reduce wasteful spending, organize public campaigns to strengthen health and education. Unfortunately, though, what we're also seeing is a growing number of countries that are passing laws designed specifically to stifle civil society. They're forcing groups to register with governments, eroding human rights protections, restricting NGOs from accessing foreign funding, cracking down on communications technologies that connect civil society groups around the globe. In more extreme cases, activists and journalists have been arrested on false charges, and some have been killed. We're also seeing new and fragile democracies cracking down on civil society, which I believe sets them back and sends a dangerous signal to other countries. So in recent years, the international community has stepped up our support. 2 years ago, some of you recall, we came together to launch the Open Government Partnership to promote transparent, effective, and accountable institutions in partnership with civil society. 60 countries and a broad coalition of civil society and private sector partners have joined. The community of democracies is working to take aim at restrictive laws. The Human Rights Council established the first special rapporteur on the rights of peaceful assembly and association, and several governments and foundations, including many in this room, contribute to a lifeline fund for emergency aid to civil society groups under threat. So I've made a point to meet with civil society worldwide. Virtually every foreign trip that I take, I carve out time to meet with citizens who are active on a whole range of issues. And in part, it's to lift up the good work they're doing and affirm that the United States stands behind their efforts. Nevertheless, we have to recognize that the crackdown continues, and we urgently need to do more to increase global attention and spur global action. So that's why we're here. I'm challenging all of us to use the next 12 months to make progress in three key areas. First, we have to identify specific steps that countries, including the United States, can take to make it easier for civil society to do its job and to encourage governments to embrace civil society groups as partners. Number two, we need to do more to stand against restrictions on civil society and better coordinate our diplomacy when the government tries to stifle civil society. I think it's critical that the international community should be working together to ensure that there are actual consequences. And number three, we have to find new and better ways to support civil society in difficult circumstances. Governments that restrict civil society are sharing their worst practices. We've got to make sure that we're sharing our best practices and doing all we can to help civil society succeed. Many of you know that I didn't begin my career in elective politics. I began working in low-income communities in Chicago. I was elected as president through the active participation of citizens. And so I know what active citizens can do. And the United States, as one of, I think, our most precious gifts, has been trying to set an example of how active citizens can make a country stronger. That makes us deeply committed to protecting the rights of all people who are contributing to our nation's progress, or their nation's progress. And as other countries crack down, I believe we've got to step up together. Those of us in this room, but a whole lot of people outside this room as well. So I'm going to be looking for specific actions, specific follow-up steps, and with that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to the Deputy Secretary General for his remarks, and then we'll make sure that this outstanding panel all has an opportunity to make their contributions.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and fellow panelists, and dear guests, and ladies and gentlemen and friends. First of all, thank you, Mr. President, for taking this initiative to support civil society. We know about your personal engagement with this matter, with the relationship to civil society and community life, which is really the basis for vitality of a democracy. Also, this initiative touches upon so much of the work that brings all the leaders to New York this week. And the message that I'm delivering here is on behalf of Secretary Ban Ki-moon, who it wasn't possible for him to leave this afternoon. The science of cloning isn't advanced enough for him to be here. So his message and mine is the following. We are living in turbulent times. The relationship between leaders and those they govern is changing. There are new demands, there are new expectations, there is new technology. But one act, one approach, one human phenomenon has to be at the heart of this relationship, and that is listening. Listening. If leaders do not listen to their people, they will hear from them in the streets, in the squares, or as we see far too often on the battlefield. There is a better way. More participation, more democracy, more engagement, more openness. And this means maximum space for civil society. Free and independent civil society is the foundation for healthy, responsive governance. Civil society is crucial for human rights by raising awareness and ringing the alarm about abuse, inequality, and authoritarianism. Indeed, civil society is central to advancing the work of the United Nations across our whole agenda, not only on human rights, but also for peace and security, as well as for development. I would say that civil society has never been more in the center and more needed than it is today. And that is why the growing pressures and restrictions facing civil society, as the President just outlined, in country after country are so disturbing. Legislation is often targeting civil society organizations, making it practically impossible for them to operate. We are seeing a rise in laws that restrict the activities of human rights defenders. We are seeing new ways to impede their work by sometimes overreaching anti-terrorism and national security legislation, measures relating to public morals or defamation, laws requiring registration of and funding of associations, and new rules restricting internet access. The assault on human rights defenders and civil society groups is sometimes matched with outright attacks in different forms: smear campaigns, travel bans, harassment and intimidation, illegal detentions, sometimes even torture and death. Reprisals and intimidation against people who cooperate with the United Nations is unacceptable. Not only because they help us, as I've seen myself all over the world, to do the work that we are mandated to do by the UN Charter and by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but because this also scares others from working with us and for us. We must take action at every level to strengthen the voices of democracy. I would hope leaders and others in positions of influence that they publicly and systematically condemn acts of reprisal and intimidation. And I welcome ongoing discussions to ensure a strong UN system-wide response to reprisals. There should be impartial investigations to bring perpetrators to justice and remedies for victims. And of course, we must reinforce the indispensable role of United Nations Special Rapporteurs in protecting all aspects of human rights, including the rights to freedom of association and assembly. And Mr. Kiai here is monitoring exactly that aspect of the human rights machinery. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, people and civil society groups often risk their lives to improve the lives of others. They speak out even when they know that they could be silenced forever. They highlight problems that others ignore and might not even think exist. They seek and they connect with like-minded people across the world, but we all know that far too often they are left at times to feel all alone. We must never desert or forget them. They protect our rights. They deserve our rights. All of us have a responsibility to respect fundamental human rights and protect those who advocate for them. When that does not happen, all of us have an obligation to stand up and speak out. And you have provided us with an opportunity to do that tonight, Mr. President. Let us do that today and every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to hear from Mr. Ariel.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm truly honored to be here to have this opportunity to represent not only my country, but also the Open Government Partnership, an initiative that was launched by President Obama here in New York in 2011. As you know, I was born in a nation where basic civil and political rights were described in a piece of paper that we used to call our Constitution. But in reality, none of them, or a few of them, were really part of citizens' lives. A country that was not even able to organize a democratic election in the 70s. A country that limited the ability of the people to speak their minds freely. A country where, for example, transparency and accountability from government or free press was merely an illusion. Even Mario Vargas Llosa, the renowned, as you know, Nobel writer, described my country as la dictadura perfecta, the perfect dictatorship. However, in less than a generation, the Mexican political and civic landscape has changed dramatically. We're still facing a number of problems. We are not quite there yet. But I can tell you that we are no longer la dictadura perfecta. We have been able to build strong electoral institutions, transparency institutions, economic institutions that were able to give to the people to make reality what our Constitution used to say, to give us our most basic civil and political rights. And when I say that we were the ones who built this, it's not an euphemism. Change in my country hadn't been possible without a growingly independent and vibrant civil society that at times challenges government and at the other times collaborates with government. And by doing so, this held the government to higher standards. At this very moment, for example, back in Mexico, civil society leaders, academics are involved in the policy process of the most relevant reforms that are taking place in Mexico. Education reform, for example, transparency reform, even fiscal reform. And in this context, the Open Government Partnership has provided a positive and practical framework to deepen this engagement, to have a structure and critical and at the same time constructive dialogue between government and civil society. Let's not forget that all OGP countries have signed an open government declaration that states we commit to protecting the ability of civil society organizations to operate in a context that guarantees freedom of expression, association, and opinion. This is their commitment. Such an enabling environment requires policies that guarantee the rights of citizens to organize and to participate. Unfortunately, just as Mexico and other OGP countries are putting forward new ways of openness and new ways of civil society to engage, there are trends in the other direction, as President Obama pointed out. For example, according to the latest Civicus report on enabling environment for civil society organizations, 57% of the world population live right now in countries where the basic liberties and political freedoms are curtailed. This trend to reduce the space for civil society organization is not a matter of South versus North. We have to be aware of that. It's taking place in a wide range of countries, even in some countries that are part of OGP. That is why we need not only clear principles on the issue, but we also need a strong and rapid response. As a civil society member of the OGP Steering Committee, I will work with my colleagues to take up the challenge of identifying concrete ways in which we can counter closing spaces for civil society as well as for opening them. I propose that OGP should organize a plenary discussion on the topic of defending civic space at our upcoming meeting in London at the end of October. We expect there are nearly 1,000 government, civil society, and private sector leaders from around 70 different countries to participate. This will be an incredible and formidable platform to discuss this issue. Even we should consider to put in place a special task force to implement the ideas that might come out from this meeting. Finally, let's not forget that responsibility to succeed in this endeavor is not only from governments, but also and mainly from civil society itself. We need to be far better organized across sectors, across issues, across regions, across genders, across social class. The world needs not only more, but better, stronger civil society. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Next, I would like to turn to President Elbedord, who has done outstanding work in his own country of Mongolia, but is also representing the community of democracies. Mr. President.
President Obama, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, For the 2 years, Mongolia was honored to serve as president of the Community of Democracies. During our tenure, we gave birth to the Asia Democracy Network to serve as an umbrella organization in our region. We also included protecting civil society as one of our 5 priority areas during our chairmanship. I am proud of Mongolia's record valuing civil society. Non-governmental organizations are vitally important to promote peace, democracy, environmental protection, and transparency in nations throughout the world. Non-governmental organizations are truly the soul of any nation. I was one of the founders of the first non-governmental organization in our nation, the Mongolian Democratic Union. It helped bring the democratic transition to my great land. There are now over 6,000 non-governmental organizations are working in Mongolia, supporting a variety of causes ranging from economic transparency to saving wildlife to promoting human rights. I am proud that non-governmental organizations do not need permission and are not restricted in any way in my country. Our civil society is vibrant. It's part of the Mongolian soul. Sadly, that is not the case everywhere. Nearly 2.4 billion people around the globe continue to live in countries where they have little to no say in who leads their country or how they are governed. Just this April in Ulaanbaatar, the Community of Democracies held its 7th Ministerial Conference. A key component in the Ulaanbaatar Declaration was our concern about the restrictions placed on non-governmental organizations in some countries. In our joint statement on promotion and protection of civil society, we noted the strength and vibrancy of nations depends on the vigorous, unfettered role of civil society, a robust engagement between governments and civil society to advance shared goals of peace, prosperity, and the well-being of all citizens. Civil society organizations are vital to advance democracy. Governments that attack civil society often repress freedom, curtail expression, and discriminate against minorities. Non-governmental organizations protect those who need it. Civil society really equals democracy. Active citizen involvement adds both talent and capacity to national development. Myself and the former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton launched the Land Network in Ulaanbaatar in July last year to connect leaders from both advanced and new democracies through a digital platform to share experiences. We can build on this success. We can advance the Open Government Initiative, and Mongolia fully supports the establishment of a CD United program. Civil societies are our partners. All citizens matter, whether rich or poor, majority or minority, disabled or just out of the mainstream. Civil society protects their interests and allows all citizens to engage in their society in public policy. Human talent is the greatest natural resource of all. Non-governmental organizations and civil society are the means to harness that talent and give voice to the voiceless, power to powerless, and hope to hopeless. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for the outstanding statement. Next, we'd ask the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of assembly and association, Manakai, to deliver his brief remarks. And obviously, Maina has his thoughts as well in his home country that has gone through just a terrible terrorist attack over the last several days. And I want to once again express publicly my sympathy for what's happening there and pledging continued U.S. support in response.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Presidents, Prime Ministers, the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, ladies and gentlemen. With your permission, Mr. President, could I please ask everyone to join me in a moment of silence in respect of those who lost their lives and got injured in the despicable terror attacks in Kenya. Thank you. I am honored to have been asked to address you on the issues that I deal with every day, not just as the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association, but also as an active human rights defender. And I would like to especially thank President Barack Obama for hosting this important event. My mandate was created with unanimous support in October 2010, and I extend my appreciation to the core group that put forward the resolution creating it. It comes up for renewal this week at the Human Rights Council, and we hope that it will be adopted unanimously again. The mandate was established against a backdrop of concern about the shrinking space for civil society globally. It came into sharp focus in early 2011 with a series of protests in the Arab region and beyond. But it also came at a time of unprecedented opportunities for civil society's participation in governance. Today, citizens have much more information available about issues that affect their lives. Information technology allows them to organize themselves to make sure their voices are heard. The protests helped remind us that freedoms of peaceful assembly and association are essential to democracy and development. They are indispensable to the enjoyment of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Without civil society, we would not have brought an end to slavery, got women the vote, or liberated people from dictatorships. Nor could we provide the effective disaster response in the way the Kenya Red Cross has so ably done these last few days in Nairobi. But sadly, challenges have increased, despite rhetorical commitments from states. Civil society and those voicing dissent face some of the most significant challenges, unlike those who support official policies. In Laos, for example, Sombath Somphone was disappeared last December for his advocacy of land rights of peasants, never to be heard from again. And there are similar challenges for Woza in Zimbabwe, the opposition in Venezuela, human rights defenders in Russia, those who walk to work in Uganda, Swaram in Malaysia, anti-capitalism protesters in Western countries, and activists in Algeria, Bahrain, Belarus, China, Cuba, and Sri Lanka, to name but a few. Repressive legislation, often shared between states, is becoming a threat to civil society as member states make laws criminalizing or restricting this work. Tolerance of others must be harnessed. We don't have to agree with what people do, but as long as it's done peacefully and does not incite violence and hatred, it should be allowed. Or to use President Obama's words, we need to learn to disagree agreeably. At no time is this more important than during elections. Elections are a unique moment in the life of any nation, determining the direction of policies and priorities. No other event better exemplifies the right to public participation, as I will report to the UN General Assembly in October. But the international community has effectively narrowed this space by focusing simply on the casting of the vote. Public participation must be seen in the context of what happens with all rights, before, during, and after casting a vote. And increasingly, we are seeing violations of the rights of peaceful assembly and association in the context of elections, as politicians seek to retain or gain power at all costs. Indeed, so central are elections that I believe no other moment requires more space for civil society. The right to freedom of association includes the right to seek, receive, and use resources from domestic, foreign, and international sources. Restrictions on funding have become a major existential threat to associations across the world, as we see in Ethiopia, where new laws restricting funding were introduced in 2009. States are obliged to facilitate, not restrict, access to funding so that associations can effectively take part in democratic and developmental processes, just like businesses and governments. This calls for a change to a human rights-based approach instead of a results-based only approach. Finally, Intimidation has been dramatically elevated by an abusive social media, especially focused on those calling for democratic change and accountability. In Kenya, for instance, some in the social media have turned civil society evil society, inciting people to attack those supporting the International Criminal Court. Just a few days ago, the Kenya police had to provide my elderly mother with protection because a group threatened to torch her homestead. This was clearly in retaliation for my work fueled by internet abuse. And across the world, state and non-state actors cleverly stalk the internet in the new war on civil society. Let me now suggest how we can reverse these emerging threats to civil society. First, we must provide public recognition and political support to civil society, recognizing that assembly and association are central to democracy and development. Denying these rights often leads to social unrest. We must give as much attention to human rights and civil society issues as we do to issues of trade, security, and other strategic interests. And we need to refocus development and governance paradigms away from results-based approaches and emphasize human rights and space for civil society, including strengthening the demand side of governance and development. It is not enough that states have made progress on the MDGs. They should also make progress on human rights. We need to provide political support to the Human Rights Council's special procedures mandates, including extending standing invitations to all UN special procedures. More than 30 of my requests for invitations have gone unanswered, for instance. And we need to ensure that civil society takes part in decision-making processes, particularly for policies which affect their work. Civil society should be key in the ongoing discussions on the post-2015 development agenda, which should include substantive endorsement of human rights. And let me conclude by welcoming the engagement of the Open Government Partnership and the Community of Democracies and other multilateral bodies in supporting the consistent work of my mandate of highlighting good practices and norms for member states so as to advance international law and standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maina. Next, I'd ask Ken Lay, a Burmese civil society activist, to speak, and obviously there's enormous significance hearing from her, given the transformation that's beginning to take place in Burma, in Myanmar. It is not something that is complete yet, but I think it testifies to the power of civil society to bring about change even in some of the most difficult situations. So please, Ken.
Thank you very much. President Obama, UN Deputy Secretary General, and other distinguished guests, I'm honored and humbled by your invitation to speak here today. To put this in perspective, until 2011, I have never even left Burma. I would like to thank President Obama for initiating this very important discussion. I also appreciate the efforts of the countries around the world that have helped to facilitate the transition and are working to deepen the reforms in my country. I also appreciate Freedom House support for arranging various meetings in New York and Washington, D.C. during my visit to the U.S. Although I will focus on Burma, I believe our experiences are likely shared by others. I respectfully salute those civil society actors in this room and around the world for their dedication, sacrifice, and courage. My name is Ken Lee, and I'm a founder of the Triangle Women Support Group, an organization that works to empower women to be decision makers and leaders at home, in their communities, and in politics. When I was young, I was also involved in Burma's democracy movement. That's why, like thousands of others, I was arrested and jailed for my non-violence democratic movement. Today, Burma is finally changing, but the struggle will be long and difficult. Civil society activists still continue to face traditional forms of repression, such as imprisonment and harassment. 50 years of military rule and economic mismanagement will not be undone overnight. But as part of the reforms, the government has begun revisiting the country's law, including those that were previously used to control society. In July, the government has been drafting a new association law. The first draft included many limitations on civil society, including severe penalties and a prohibition on informal associations, which are the principal way that citizens organize in Burma. In response, we mobilized a broad coalition of civil society organizations, including environmental groups, health rights activists, women's groups, and labor activists to push for a better law. We also sought the advice of the international community, including groups here with us today, to ensure that the revisions met international norms. We share our recommendations with the government and members of parliament. Today, I'm happy to inform you that the revised draft law is satisfactory and it's now before parliament for consideration. The fact that Burma's draft association law is now significantly improved is a testament to not just a strong domestic response, but to the valuable support of the international community. I would like to share my ideas about kinds of the international community's support that have been proven to be useful to our efforts to bolster the reform process, not only in Burma, but also in other countries. First, we have learned enormously from other countries' experience. Groups like the World Movement for Democracy and the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law facilitated the exchange of experience and knowledge with advocacy efforts in other countries, as well as the information about international norms and standards. Second, international groups such as National Endowment for Democracy and others quickly responded to our request for support to convene a series of meetings among civil society groups and with the government and the MPs to discuss the draft law. Third, political support from the international community has been critically important. Sometimes coordinated responses from the diplomatic community is more important than financial support, like sometimes sticks, sometimes carrots. Together, we have made progress. If the association law is passed, it will provide a foundation upon which civil society can flourish. However, unless the government recognizes the value of dissent and strengthens independent institutions to enforce the law, the benefits of the vibrant, independent civil society will never fully realize, and the country will suffer as a result. The role of the civil society is crucial to build the democratic society and to implement the global issues such as global warming, poverty alleviation, and public health. However, today, in too many countries, governments seek to limit and restrict civil space by means of strong bureaucratic control, weakening protection mechanisms, etc. With support from members of the international community, I firmly believe we can make progress. Together, we can build democratic and open societies where individuals have the opportunity to live with dignity, free from repression and deprivation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have enough time to take some brief comments or questions from some of the civil society organizations that are represented here today. There are two in particular I want to call on. First of all, I'd like to hear from Adosaki from Zimbabwe, so that we can get a sense of the work that's being done there. And then I'd like an opportunity to take a comment from Darren Walker, the Ford Foundation, because the philanthropic community can play a very important role in supporting civil society groups, and I know that Ford is looking at ways in which it can make an even greater commitment in the future. So, Otto, let's start with you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the event, and we hope that it's not going to end as an event, but it's going to be sustained in systematic engagement around issues affecting civil society globally. Just a couple of points that I would want to make. The first is that we've noticed that increasingly there is use of the law, and it becomes not rule of law, but rule by law. And the phenomenon of these laws being passed globally is concerning and alarming. So we need to really work around how to address that phenomenon where countries are saying we are operating in terms of our laws and we are sovereign nations for that matter. That is the first. The second is that we've noticed that it's what we have termed strangulation by regulation, slowly suffocating civil society groups by coming up with a number of administrative barriers to their operation. And again, this is a phenomenon that is on the increase. And persecution through prosecution, where repeatedly groups are arrested, arraigned before the courts, and maybe subsequently acquitted. By the time that you would have spent going through the court processes, appearing and reappearing, and only to be acquitted. The last and most important, issue that has to be brought to the fore. I recall that on your maiden trip to Africa soon after your election, you mentioned that we need strong institutions and not strong individuals. Sadly, we have noticed that many of the institutions that we are tending to rely on are severely compromised, and it would be key to have groups such as the African Union, SADC, ECOWAS, East African Community, taking up a leadership role in respect to these various issues. I thank you.
Let me just comment on a couple of points that you just made. Number one, it is true that many countries that are trying to restrict civil society may pass laws, and then they'll argue that they're observing the law and civil society groups are not observing the law. But this is why I think developing institutional structures that constrain what government can do is so important. And you mentioned the trip that I took to Africa. I've specifically met with the chief justices from a number of countries because an independent judiciary that is properly functioning and properly financed can serve as an important protector of civil society. Unfortunately, what we see in a lot of countries is that the resources for judiciary, for the proper application of the law is often significantly compromised. And one of the things that I think all of us as heads of state can do in supporting these efforts is make sure that when we look at our aid programs, when we look at our diplomatic efforts, that we are not ignoring some of those institutional bodies that offer some measures of relief or potential protection for the civil societies organizations that are taking place. It also means those civil society activists have to think strategically about what is it that they're promoting. And if you have a environmental organization, a human rights organization, an economic cooperative, on the surface, their issues may be different, but they'll all have an interest potentially in fighting a registration law in the country that makes it more difficult for them to operate. And I think creating coalitions inside those countries that focus on laws that across the board impact civil society, rather than focusing on just a few set of narrow issues, I think can make a difference as well. But I very much appreciate your comments. Now, one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing when it comes to civil society is the issue of financial support. Historically, we've seen support, including from institutions based here in the United States. That then becomes an excuse for governments who say, well, civil society is being funded by outsiders and is, in some fashion undermining our sovereignty. And this is where I think philanthropic organizations can make an enormous impact. And so I would be interested in hearing, Darren, the kinds of steps that you at Ford and some of the other philanthropies, not just here in the United States, but around the world, may be looking at.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for convening us, and thank you for your passion and your authentic leadership.
Let's get that mic working. Do we have another one?
Here you go. Try this one.
Thank you.
That was not an instance of censorship.
Thank you. Thank you.
Simply a technical
Thank you.
difficulty.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. President, thank you for convening us. Thank you for your passion, and thank you for your authentic leadership, because you understand the importance of civil society at the ground. So I'm here this afternoon with my colleagues from Open Society, Omidyar, MacArthur, and other philanthropies, because we believe deeply in civil society. In fact, our missions cannot be accomplished without strong, robust, vibrant civil society. And so we invest in people, leaders. We invest in institutions that are necessary in societies to hold government accountable. So our mission can't be achieved, and the challenge that you have put out is not a hollow one. What we do not want is to have another meeting with a lot of great presentations and conversation and no follow-up. And so what I think my colleagues and I are here today to say is that we are ready to follow up. We are ready to commit, recommit, and in the case of the Ford Foundation, to increase our support for civil society around the world. So I thank you for your call to action. My colleagues and I thank you for your challenge to us, and we look forward to following up this fall at the meeting to actually put in place a concrete plan and strategy for action. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's close out by hearing from Douglas Rutson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Non-for-Profit Law, is doing some outstanding work. Doug?
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for hosting us today. Thank you also for your personal engagement on this issue. It's exceptionally important, but it's also exceptionally appreciated. And when I reflect on next steps, in your opening comment about the role of civil society in the civil rights movement, I was reminded of a speech by Dr. Martin Luther King at Oberlin College in 1965. You know the speech. He told this tale of Rip Van Winkle. And he said the storyline is known to most of us. Rip climbs a mountain, he falls asleep, and he wakes up 20 years later. And Dr. King tells the students, the most interesting thing is not the fact that he slept for 20 years, but as he left town, the village inn had a painting of King George. And when he returned, it was a painting of George Washington. And he said that there was this quest for dignity, for freedom. There was a revolution, and Rip Van Winkle had nothing to do with it. He was sleeping. He was snoring. So what I would say to all of us here is let's not suffer the fate of Rip Van Winkle. Mr. President, you said there's a historic contest over civic space. Countries around the world are passing laws restricting civil society. These countries expect that the international community will respond with epic slumber, but we must respond with vigilance and vigor instead. And I know that challenges abound, but I'm actually an optimist. I'm an optimist again because I think of that speech back in 1965, and Dr. King said there are 3 elements to an alert response. And listening to the discussions today, all three elements are with us today. First, he said we need a world perspective. We heard from the three multilateral platforms today that are specifically focused on safeguarding civil society. The Community of Democracies, the UN Special Rapporteur, and I would include the Lifeline Initiative. And then there are this sort of host of multilateral platforms that are addressing broader issues, open government partnership. We also have to engage with the Financial Action Task Force to ensure that our counterterrorism measures don't unintentionally undermine what we're trying to do today. And of course, the post-2015 development agenda. Second, Dr. King said we need a coalition of conscience. And it's really interesting when you look around this room, and I greet all my friends watching online, we come from different countries, we work for different sectors, but we share a common vision. Whether we spend our days providing humanitarian relief in Syria, working on disability rights, or we work for an environmental group, we share a common vision in which people can work together to make the world a better place. And it's now up to us to build the base. Let's build the base together. We need to include, as you said, Mr. President, members of the judiciary, the private sector, parliamentarians, and let's not forget the person on the street. We just can't talk to the policy elite. Third, Dr. King said we need tireless and persistent efforts to achieve progress. And as we move forward, let's figure out what we can do together. For governments, imagine what would happen if we were all committed to coordinated diplomatic action. We funded civil society law reform, and there were an executive order or a policy directive letting everyone in your government know that civil society is a national priority both domestically and internationally. Wow, we'd make a lot of progress. But we can't just rely on one sector. We know in civil society, we have an obligation as well. And so we need to get together, coordinate, map activities, identify gaps, and enhance our impact. And at ICNL, we'll try to do our part as well. You spoke, Mr. President, about enhancing domestic policy reform and forming coalitions. That's what we do. We've done it in 100 countries. And we will commit to do more of it. Thanks to the visionary donors in Sweden and the United States and the foundations here, we'll offer assistance to any country, including those in this room, because we must lead by example that wants to reform its legal framework. Second, we know there's this great thirst for international information. So later today, we're going to launch the world's largest collection of civil society legal materials. Thanks to the Gates Foundation, 3,000 documents, 60 languages, all 198 UN member states. It'll be online for free immediately after this meeting. And finally, we'll work with you. Let's work together with multilateral platforms, with governments, with international organizations and civil society to take concrete actions. I agree with Darren. What we'll do is we'll not only help organize meetings, we'll help fund them too. We'll bring money to the table. So in conclusion, I thank you, Mr. President, for convening us today and giving us the gift of momentum. We have a historic opportunity to shape the future of civil society, and as we leave this room, let us be inspired by the words of Dr. King. Let us adopt a world perspective, let us create a coalition of conscience, and let us work tirelessly and together to make the world a better place. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you all.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank all who spoke for their outstanding contributions. Let me just make a few closing remarks. Number one, the fact that I'm here, I think, indicates the degree to which the United States takes this very seriously. The work is hard, and sometimes you take a step back for every 2 steps forward. Certainly that was the history here in the United States. Dr. King's been mentioned several times. The restrictive laws that were put in place the challenges to funding from outside groups, the threats and the intimidation and the violence and the jailings. These were all things that the early civil rights movement here in the United States went through. And yet, because justice was on their side, they ultimately prevailed. And I have confidence that, in the words of Dr. King, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And it's a matter of us staying with it. And the United States, as a matter of government policy, stands behind civil society organizations. Now, those of us who head up governments in this room, I think we have to recognize that when we're interacting with our colleagues from other countries that may not have as much respect for civil society as we do, that we have a lot of business to transact. And there are security issues, and there are trade issues, and there are energy issues. And I recently spoke with some civil society groups in Russia, and I was very honest with them. I said, as President of the United States, I've got to take all those issues into account. I can't only talk about civil society and human rights issues in a bilateral meeting. I'm going to have to talk about a whole range of things. But what is also true is me making a statement that this is important, bringing it up in a bilateral meeting, makes a difference. It gives other countries pause. It makes them reflect on whether or not they are doing what they should be doing. And so I would just urge those of us who have that capacity to make sure that this is on our agenda. It's not the only agenda, but it is an important aspect of the agenda, and us bringing it up does make a difference. I would also say that it's important, as has already been noted, that we don't just issue strong pronouncements, but we also have action behind it. And a number of specific things have already been mentioned. Making sure that we're sharing best practices effectively. What Doug talked about in terms of gathering model laws, essentially, that then could empower Otto and others who are in the field to say, this is what would help us in terms of providing protections. That's something very specific that we can do. Making sure that we find ways to adequately fund civil society groups in ways that are less easily characterized as being tools of the United States or Western powers. I think that's an area where philanthropy can make a big difference. And I've talked to my team about, are there ways in which we can internationalize funding for these efforts so that they're less easily caricatured. I also think it's going to be important for us to continue to shine the spotlight on the issue and publicize these issues in more effective ways, particularly at a time when much of the efforts that we've heard about have to do with restricting access to the Internet. Are there ways that we can use the Internet more effectively to open up space rather than to see that space closed? So the instructions to my team and my government are that we are going to put our full support behind these efforts. What we want to see is concrete outcomes, not just window dressing. We will continue to try to mobilize as many countries as possible to get involved in this process. And we do so because ultimately we believe that governments that are representative and accountable to their people are going to be more peaceful, they're going to be more prosperous, they're going to be better partners for us. It is not just charity, it is something that we believe is in our national interests and our security interests. We've all observed, I think, some of the convulsions that have been taking place in the Arab Spring. And I think it's a reminder that things are not always a smooth path. But I want to affirm that over the long run, we will all be better off if You know, that small shopkeeper or that small farmer or that young student or that disabled person or that gay or lesbian person or that ethnic minority or that religious minority, if they have a voice and their dignity is respected, that's what will preserve our dignity, and that's what will ensure our security over the long term. That's why we're invested in this. That's why I'm very excited about all the work that we're doing, and that's why I want to say thank you to all of you who participated. Okay. All right. Good. Thank you.